Well, hello everyone, and welcome back um, to a program that we have decided. Mike came up with the name of
Preterist.
Preterist Apologetics. I
Yep.
loved it the minute he sent it to me. He said, "Hey, what about this?" And I go, "Works for me." uh, so that's what our little get together will be called from now on. And uh, when Mike contacted me, was it yesterday you asked me if I'd be up for doing a show?
Yeah, I think so.
I think, well, I wasn't sure. I was hopeful I would be. So far, so good. Um, but I asked him, I said, well, what do you want to do? He asked me what I want to do. I said, well, you just pick a topic and I'll follow along here. So he sent me an outline, a proposed outline of what we want to do. Now, obviously, folks, Doug Wilson and all of the signers of the letter condemning covenant eschatology believe that 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the crux interpretum, to use that term. It's the foundational text for proving a yet future physical resurrection of decomposed human bodies out of the ground. And I'll be really candid. I think Mike's the same way. In my eschatological struggles, 1 Corinthians 15 was the passage that I hung on to the most. I mean, it was the last straw for me. And I think it is with most people. And so, anyway, like I said, Mike has put together a great list of topics that we want to discuss. And I will guarantee you we're not going to get through the whole list tonight. But what we want to do by way of responding to Doug Wilson, and by the way, a challenge has been issued once again to Doug Wilson to debate Mike Sullivan or Don Preston in either a one-to-one debate with Mike and Doug, or Doug and a partner of his choice and me, kind of a tag team type of debate. We don't know what's going to come of that. All right. Nothing at all is firm. Nothing at all has been settled. But the proposal and the challenge has been issued. We will see what happens. We will certainly keep our audience here posted to see if anything comes of that. I'm exactly like Mike. Nothing would please me more than to see Doug Wilson agree to have a tag team debate, even a one-on-one debate, to address the issues that he raised in condemning those of us who believe, well, basically all that we believe is God kept his word.
Exactly.
And we're called heretics for that. So that's the huge irony here, folks. So anyway, one of the very first things that we want to discuss is as we look at 1 Corinthians 15, we want to start where Paul started. And Paul says, moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel, which I declared unto you, which you have received, by which also you are saved, wherein also you stand, if you keep in memory that which I delivered unto you, how that Christ died for our sins. And here's where Mike and I really, really want to focus, according to the scriptures, how that he was buried, how that he arose again the third day, according to the scriptures. So, Mike, why don't you give us just a little bit of a synopsis of where we're going to focus our attention as we begin a study of 1 Corinthians 15, based upon the fact that Paul twice, in 4 verses, Paul twice says, I delivered unto you what Christ did according to the scriptures.
Yeah, and Paul's doing this because the Gentile sect and some others don't believe in the resurrection of the dead ones. And so he starts off by making an argument that all of the apostles preached this one gospel, that Jesus rose according to the Old Testament scriptures. And he will use that common ground, as Don and I will eventually argue here. They were not denying Christ's resurrection.
Amen.
So he starts out there with a unity with all of the other apostles preaching the singular gospel. Now, according to the scriptures, is interesting because where exactly, I mean, if you debate a rabbi, the first thing they're going to be, where is this? We see the suffering Messiah, maybe, but where is this resurrected Messiah? And I think I would go to what, Hosea 6, Jonah, and this whole concept, Don, again, that the Jews in the first century had this idea, this theology that when Messiah came, he would recapitulate Israel's history. Throughout Israel's history, she had died and she had risen from the dead. And so now Messiah would do the same thing. And it wasn't like super, super laid out, but it was through types and shadows and and there's some inferences as well. I think maybe, is it Isaiah 53, where he is cut off without any children, but yet the next verses later, he has his progeny. He has a whole family of children. So I think that is another passage that would probably imply the resurrection of Messiah.
And we might also throw in Isaiah chapter 66, where Isaiah speaks of my bones being refreshed, or my bones rejoicing. That's kind of resurrection imagery there as well.
Yes. I'm having some light issues. I'll be right back.
Oh, okay. Well, Mike works on his lighting issues. Let me point out what we are getting at here, and that Mike stated very well, and that is that what Paul was saying to the Corinthians in order to correct the denial not of resurrection, and this, we'll talk more about this undoubtedly later on. The Corinthians were not denying resurrection, period. End of story. That's a major fallacy in 99.9% of all commentators that you pick up. The commentators say, well, Paul was addressing those who were denying the resurrection. No such thing. So anyway, moving on, and we'll cover this more in depth later. But the key point we want to focus on at this particular point is that Paul is telling them, again, as Mike's already suggested, that what they are declaring, what Paul and the other apostles are declaring, is that Christ is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. Now, why is this so important in our response to Doug Wilson? And not only Doug Wilson, but the postmillennialists out there who vehemently attack us. And here's the reason. In both the amillennial world and in the postmillennial world, it is firmly believed that God was essentially through with Israel at the cross. Now, in the postmillennial world, and even among some amillennialists, for instance, Kim Riddlebarger, in his book In Defense of Amillennialism, takes what is, for all practical purposes' sake, a postmillennial view of Israel. That is to say, at the end of the current Christian age, national Israel will be converted. But here's the paradox. While they appeal to Romans chapter 11 to justify that position, to my knowledge, and Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but in my reading of the postmillennial literature, and certainly in the amillennial, reformed amillennial world, there is not a strong emphasis on, for instance, the resurrection at the end of the Christian age being in fulfillment of God's old covenant promises made to old covenant Israel. Now, they may almost cursorily refer to Isaiah 25 or even Isaiah 26. Kenneth Gentry, for instance, in his book, He Shall Have Dominion, 2009 edition, says that Isaiah chapter 26 is talking about the raising of biological bodies out of the dirt. That's his position. Well, he doesn't seem to see the implications of taking that position. And no amillennialist that I'm aware of really sees the implications of taking that position. So let me state my premise here. And by the way, in my newest book, which was introduced last week, by the way, these are the days in which all things written, all in which all things must be fulfilled. I lay out the following premise. All New Testament eschatology is the reiteration of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. There are no, I've been going around, Mike, with some folks on YouTube about this premise. When I've said there are no new eschatological promises in the New Testament, they are all the reiteration of God's Old Testament promises made to Old Testament Israel.
And you know what's funny about that is it doesn't matter what Bible college you're in or what seminary you're in, and you hear it from the pulpit constantly. The Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And yet people are so locked into their theologies and their systems that they can't even see that basic reality that Paul preached no other things except that which could be found in the law and the prophets. It's bizarre.
Listen, in the amillennial world that I was raised in, which is the Stone Campbell movement, one of the most fundamental doctrines. I mean, it's still found in Church of Christ and Christian church literature and some others associated with that movement. But I mean, absolutely fundamental is God was through with Old Covenant Israel at the cross. God was through with the law at the cross. God nailed the law to the cross. And beginning on Pentecost onward, he was dealing exclusively with the church, having nothing to do with the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. And so, pardon me, when I when I stumbled, literally, when I stumbled onto the truth, it's like, wait a minute. Paul in Acts chapter 24 says, this I confess to you, as he's standing on trial for his life for preaching the resurrection. Paul said, this I confess to you, that after the way which they call a sect, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things that are written in the law and the prophets, that there's about to be the resurrection of the just and the unjust. Mike, I will never, ever forget the day I saw that for the very first time. It was, it was just like the proverbial steamroller that just, it just flattened me out. And I was like, wait, time out. Lord, are you telling me I've been wrong all these years? Yeah, that's basically what was being said. And in subsequent years, in formal debates with my Church of Christ amillennial brethren, guess what? When I've asked them if their eschatology was from the Old Testament, they just said adamantly, no, absolutely not. And when I've confronted them with what Paul said in Acts 24, what Paul said in Acts chapter 25 and verse 6 and 7, when he says that all 12 tribes of Israel, he said, I proclaim the resurrection, to which hope our 12 tribes hope to attain. as I asked several individuals privately in private discussions, I said, okay, here Paul says that the resurrection was the hope of the 12 tribes of Israel. Where did they get that hope from? And the eyes glazed over, and it was like, I had one individual come back and say, well, no, you misunderstand. The 12 tribes there, that's the church. That's spiritual Israel.
Wow. That's really bad.
That was really bad. And my reaction was kind of like yours just now, like, what?
Wow.
But folks, you got to understand how important this particular aspect of the study of 1 Corinthians 15 is. Paul begins the chapter, his greatest discourse on the resurrection. He begins it by saying, I'm preaching the gospel to you And I got it from the Old Testament, because the Old Testament predicted sufferings of Christ for our sin and his resurrection on the third day, according to the scripture. And Mike, I have argued for years, as you know, 1 Corinthians 15 is an inclusio. He begins with a resurrection, I am convinced, with Hosea chapter 6. After 3 days, he will raise us up and we will live in his sight. Now, this is after saying, by his word, he has slain us. He has torn. In other words, he's killed us. But now in chapter 6, he says, after 3 days, he will raise us up and we will live. So they were slain, they're going to be raised. There's the third day. Many scholars acknowledge that, obviously.
And many scholars recognize that Christ is saying that he is Israel in the New Testament. I mean, the second Exodus, all of this stuff. Richard Hayes, N.T. Wright, but I'll point out that Jesus is the faithful Israel. Again, having that same mentality that the first century Jews had.
Absolutely right. And boy, this is so absolutely and wonderfully critical. Jesus was Israel. Going back to Exodus and Hosea, as Hosea says, I have called my son out of Egypt. Well, that was a reference back to Israel, corporate body of Israel, being taken out of Egyptian bondage. That's what God said. But now Jesus, the individual Jesus, is fulfilling what that prophecy. So it's type and it's antitype. It's corporate body now being personified. Jesus is the personification of Israel and the fulfillment of that type and the antitype. So here is Paul. He begins with Hosea chapter 6. And now notice what Paul does in 1 Corinthians chapter 55 and 56. When the mortal has put on immortality and the corruptible has put on incorruptibility, then shall be brought to pass the saying, death is swallowed up in victory. O grave, where is your victory? Citing Hosea 13:14. So Paul is using Hosea, and years ago, I produced a list of 22 parallels between the book of Hosea and 1 Corinthians 15. And if anyone's interested in that chart, I'll be glad to share it. I have it in some of my literature and some of my books, but if you'd like just a chart of that, I'll be glad to share it with you. You can contact me through my website. And I should, maybe I don't know if I ought to do this, but I will. When I shared that chart with Sam Frost, well, he still claimed to be a preterist.
Right.
He said it was one of the finest examples of exegesis he had ever seen, something to that effect. And now he calls it nonsense.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I cite it in my book. You have not the big chart of everything, but your Hosea, the outline for Paul's resurrection hope.
Right.
I love a good chart, so I thought that
well, me too.
But that is crucial. Where is Paul getting this seed analogy? If he's telling you that he doesn't teach anything except that which comes from the law and the prophets, he's not talking about some Gentile, physical body seed thing. He is a Hebrew. He's an Israelite. He is preaching from the scriptures. So if Paul has already quoted Hosea in Isaiah 25 and he's using illustrations, we should probably go to those passages and look at the context, which is just Hermeneutics 101. But this just seems to be one of those steps that I see preachers making all of the time. They never, whenever a New Testament author quotes or alludes to an Old Testament passage, they never go to the Old Testament and develop the context and find the harmony between the two, like Richard Hayes says that we have to do, which he doesn't do here.
Yeah. I started to say, I was in a discussion with someone on YouTube just the other day, and I was alluding to Richard Hayes and his use of metalepsis. And folks, metalepsis is a kind of a fancy word, but it is used by Richard Hayes in his book Conversion of the Imagination, and in other of his books as well. Um, Echoes of Scripture in the Gospel. That's echoes of Scripture in Paul. I know Mike's looking for it. He's got it. I know. There you go. There you go. Uh, Absolutely fantastic book, wonderful book. But metalepsis is the hermeneutic recognized, by the way, recognized by the ancient Hebrews. This is not something a modern scholar just thought up as a way to explain something. He's going back and looking at how the ancient Hebrew exegetes actually looked at the Old Testament, how they used the Old Testament. And it is a well-known, it's certainly well-known among scholarship now. Richard Hayes is to be commended and highly praised for bringing this understanding more to the public awareness. But anyway, the principle is this: when a writer or a speaker in Hebraic thought now, in Hebraic practice, when a rabbi, for instance, would quote from an Old Testament prophetic text, he might only use one key word that was critical to a certain given Old Testament text, but was so well known to his audience that even that one key word, because it would probably be a rare word, but he might use a given term, just a phrase from an Old Testament passage. And what that speaker or writer was doing was calling that entire prophetic context to the mind of the listener or the reader. Contrary to older commentators, and boy, I've read a bunch of those, who accused the apostles of mishandling the Old Testament scriptures, of abusing the context, of being guilty of the worst sort of cherry picking from Old Testament texts. In fact, this is not a recognized scholar by any means, but one man I was in a public debate with, when I pointed out that Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 55 and 56 quotes verbatim from Isaiah 25:8 and Hosea chapter 13, verse 14, he said, no, Paul was not appealing to those prophecies as prophecies of the end time resurrection. He was just lifting the verbiage out of those texts and using it accommodatively because it sounded right. And I was like, oh.
Wow, he's that sloppy, huh?
Oh, argumentum ad desperatum, if ever there was such an argument. I mean, but that's what happens when you're dealing with people who cannot admit for a moment that the New Testament eschatology is based on Old Testament eschatology, and yet you have Paul seemingly appealing to two key Old Testament prophecies, which are definitely talking about resurrection of some kind. So you cannot admit that Isaiah and Hosea predicted what Paul was predicting. He was just using the language. The language sounded pretty good for Paul's purpose, so he utilized it, but he really wasn't looking for what they predicted.
That's crazy.
That's what you run into in the, may I use the term, in the theological world, certainly in which I was raised, and which is not as, what word should I use? Which is not as radical or is more radical than that of Gentry or Wilson or some of the others. Like I said, Wilson and again, Gentry, Matheson, and a whole host of postmillennialists, for instance, they tell us that Romans chapter 11 is the keynote foundation of postmillennialism. Greg Bahnsen, whom you knew pretty well, when he was speaking about postmillennialism, he pointed directly to Romans 11, 25 and 27, says this is it. This is a key to postmillennialism. Kenneth Gentry takes a position, same position.
And it's interesting though that James Jordan, I don't know if you've read his article on Romans 11, all Israel being saved, and even Gary DeMar, a little briefer version of it. But I thought Jordan went the farthest because he basically said post AD 70, there's no Jew.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, covenantally, there is no Israelite, there is no Jew. And that's why so he kind of went much farther than most of your all-millennialists or post-millennialists trying to deal with national Israel, how it's going to fit in to their futurist eschatology, because all of the promises, all the resurrection promises, the new creation promises, they were all made to Israel. And it's interesting because Reformed theologians are constantly trying to deal with dispensationalists who are saying promises in the Old Testament made to Israel cannot be applied or fulfilled in the church. Pentecost, Walford, Ryrie, I mean, you name it, all these guys, even the New Covenant. And so Reformed guys are constantly saying, no, look at all the New Testament writers quoting these Old Testament passages. And so they see that they are being applied and fulfilled in and through the church, but like, as you usually say, but not divorced from Israel, with the historical context, the historical framework when these promises would be made. Because if there is no national Israel, then none of these promises can be fulfilled, period, because they were made to national Israel.
I'll never forget in one public debate that I was having when I made the point that God's promises of the resurrection were promises made to Israel. My opponent got up and he said, well, I agree that the resurrection promise was made to Israel, but it was spiritual Israel. It had nothing to do with old covenant Israel after the flesh. Well, and he even appealed to Romans chapter 8, waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. Well, the manifestation of the sons of God happens at the end of time. It's the church being vindicated, et cetera, which is a horrible abuse of the text. But nonetheless, he said that promise of the adoption, that's made to us today. That's made to the church today. Had nothing to do with the covenant Israel. So I went ahead and went to Romans chapter 9, where Paul says that, the promises concerning the adoption, which is obviously there's no chapter division. And Paul is continuing his discussion of the adoption. And he said, I'm speaking to Israel, to whom attain the promises, the adoption, my brethren, according to the flesh. Israel according to the flesh. My opponent never brought up the issue again. And the look on his face was priceless. It was one of those Kodak moments. Because here he was stuck in that view that God was through with Israel after the flesh at the cross. And so no promises made to Israel after the flesh could be valid after the cross, which is really strange, in light of Acts chapter 2, and Peter quotes Joel and says, this is that. And he is ascended to the right hand in fulfillment of Psalms 110. Oh, I thought that was nullified at the cross, on and on.
Even Paul, when he says in Romans 9 that all Israel is not Israel, we're talking about the remnant, and the remnant were of the 12 tribes of Israel. So Israel is being saved through the believing remnant. Now the Gentiles are being grafted in, and that's what most all millennialists and Reformed guys want to look at, is just the spiritual Israel concept. But no, we can't forget that the remnant, they are the ones that are of the 12 tribes.
That's exactly, and that's the whole point that Paul makes in Romans chapter 10, when he says, has God cast away his people whom he foreknew? Well, God forbid. I'm an Israelite. I am of the tribe of Benjamin. Paul wasn't saying, well, God hasn't cast off his people because I'm a member of the church and God was through with Israel. Now the church is Israel. No, that's not what Paul's saying. I'm a Benjamite. In one discussion I had with one individual, and they were saying what I just went over. And I said, well, let me ask you, since you're saying that God hasn't cast off the church, I said, that's not Paul's question. in Romans 10. That's not even close to Paul's question. But I said, since you're affirming that the Israel that Paul is talking about there is the church, tell me what tribe you're from.
Exactly. Exactly. Well,
Well, they,
in Gary DeMar's debate with Dr. Michael Brown, whom we've both debated, I can't remember what the subject was. I don't know if it was postmillennialism or the role of Israel, or I don't know what it was, but I just remember his opening question to Michael was, "Well, what tribe are you from?" And Michael said, "I think I'm from Judah." And at that point, all he had to do is drop the mic and just walk away.
yeah,
But he went on to defend, I think, postmillennialism, which I think kind of got him in a little bit of a trouble. But
yeah. Speaking of Michael Brown, I was noticing just the other day that my first debate that I had with him might have been the second. I don't know. Anyway, it's been a few years ago now, but it's been viewed 85,000 times.
wow.
So that's very, very remarkable. And it's a thrill to know that it's been viewed that many times. Okay, so folks, the point that we are making here is stunningly important. Why is that so? Well, if the promise of the resurrection, and let's just add to that we're talking about the judgment, we're talking about the parousia of Christ, we're talking about the new creation. If all of these eschatological tenets were in fact foretold by the Old Testament prophets in promises made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh, we need to be reminded of the very simple but very powerful passage uttered by Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18. Speaking to the Jews, Israel after the flesh, do not think that I am come to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Verily I say unto you, until heaven and earth passes away, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law until it is all fulfilled. Now, I keep thinking that one of these days I'm going to write an entire book just on Matthew 5, 17 and 18. I don't have time for that. But,
Haven't you?
well, I did in my Torah to Telos Volume 1. I
Uh-huh.
developed a good bit in that book, but there's so much that I did not include in it. For instance, I did not include a lengthy discussion of the significance of ellipsis in Matthew 5, 17 and 18. And here's what I mean. Do not think that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill the law and the prophets.
Yeah. They want to leave out the prophets, I
They
think.
want to leave out the prophets and say, oh, well, you see, he fulfilled the law, but he didn't fulfill the prophets. Prophecies are still left to be fulfilled, et cetera, et cetera. Understanding the nature of ellipsis becomes really the death knell of all futurist views when you look at Matthew 5, 17 and 18. And the reason for that is because the dispensationalist, for instance, Thomas Ice says, the law of Moses was completely fulfilled and removed in the first century. Okay. Every amillennialist that I'm aware of, well, there are a few exceptions. Postmillennialists agree to, at least theoretically, Greg Bonson said the law with all of its minutia, and by that he meant the sacrificial system, the feast days, etc., was nailed to the cross. The Sabbath is still binding, although it's been transformed into Sunday. you know, in his book Christian Economics, when you read his discussion, pages 223, something like that, and following, big, long, lengthy discussion of Matthew 5, 17 and 18, it makes your head spin. At least it does mine, because on the one hand, the entirety of the law has passed. On the other hand, the Sabbath is eternally binding, but it's not the same Sabbath because the Old Testament form of the Sabbath has been taken out of the way. It's been removed. Well, isn't that a whole lot of the jots and the tittles? you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
David Chilton was having some issues with that passage when he became a full preterist, and just, admitting he had struggled with that with that passage. quite a bit. And, to dovetail on the subject of your book, was it Luke 21:22?
Mm-hmm.
He talks about all that is written there. It's clear that's the law and the prophets. Everything that's been written in the law and the prophets. I mean, all I have to do is let Jesus interpret himself.
Absolutely. And one chapter that I already regret it. Okay, I really do, but I consciously left it out because Kenneth Gentry says that what Jesus meant when he said these be the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled. Kenneth Gentry says, well, the form of the Greek there means or indicates that Jesus was referring to all things that had already been written when he spoke, and that refers to the Old Testament. Therefore, he was saying that everything in the Old Testament would be fulfilled by AD 70. Well, when I read that,
Yeah, I mean, he gave the farm away right there. There was no qualifiers. There was no. And
it
I
is.
just my head like, dude.
No, you're wrong though, Mike. He didn't give the farm away. He gave away the farm, the dog, the cat, the gerbil, the goldfish.
Wow.
uh, wow, I was literally stunned when I read that.
Mhm.
And so anyway, again, one chapter that I purposely left out because I really set out to write a pretty short book. It wound up being over 200 pages long, as it is. But I left out the chapter on, well, if all things written refers to everything in the Old Testament, as Kenneth Gentry says, then that must mean that all the feast days would be fulfilled by AD 70.
Mhm.
And I debated, and I had reached the point in my writing, since I was working on my really, really big book, Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, which everybody keep your fingers crossed. I've submitted the manuscript. I'm waiting for the cover to be submitted. Everything passes muster, that book will be published within a month to 6 weeks. It's 497 pages long. So I'm really, really, really super excited about it. A lot of people have helped me out on that. So anyway, since the big book is about the feast days, okay, I thought, okay, I'm going to let that suffice. I'm not going to put it in my Luke 21 and 22 book. I already regret that. I think it would have been maybe a capstone to the book, but you know, we make decisions sometimes, and especially in book writing, that you say, okay, I got to quit. I've got to cut it off. This is enough. This is enough for this book. I'll pick it up over here. So that's what I did on that particular book. But again, here's the point, ladies and gentlemen. The Old Testament predicted the resurrection. And I want you to notice something. For those who delineate between the law and the prophets, okay, and they say, oh, the law, Jesus fulfilled the law. He didn't fulfill all prophecy. Therefore, we're still waiting for prophecy, Old Testament prophecy, to be fulfilled. Well, of course, that completely destroys everything that he said. Not one jot or one tittle shall pass until it's all. And that ellipsis comes into play. All the law and the prophets is fulfilled. But here's the point. The law itself foretold the resurrection. That's what Paul says in Acts 24, 14, and 15. I believe all things that are written in the law and the prophets, that there's about to be the resurrection of just and unjust. Paul believed that the law predicted the resurrection.
And if it didn't, then you just hear rabbis like Tovia Singer just saying, "See, I told you." These New Testament writers, they just made up their own religion. And some of these guys are pretty much falling right into that trap and developing that
Yeah.
nonsense. But no, Paul, he was preaching the fulfillment of Israel's promises from beginning to end. And it starts out here, as Don has here, with Jesus's resurrection. And at the very end of this, we're going to have a big discussion about what it means to overcome the sin, the death, and the law. And there are a lot of futurist commentators that have no idea why Paul is bringing up the Mosaic law. If the law was fulfilled at the cross, why is Paul talking about the end of the fulfillment of the Mosaic law at the end of time in world history? That doesn't compute. And Don is going to break down when we get into that section as well. Don, I want you to break down your new book and kind of talk about these remaining eschatological feasts, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Ingathering, which, First Corinthians 15 talks about this trumpet. And so that's going to be a great topic as well.
I tell you, that was the research for this book. And again, the name of the book is Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, an Examination of Sukkot, Israel's Last Feast Days. I tell you, our good friend Robert Cruikshank, that we both call the PDF guy.
Blue collar scholar. Yeah.
Huh?
We call him the blue collar scholar.
Yeah, the blue collar scholar. I tell you, Robert did me so much good. I reached out to him. I had not corresponded tremendously with Robert down through the years. I knew him casually. I knew his dad better, but nonetheless, he had made a comment or two to me at different times about some PDFs that he had found on this and that and the other, and I go, okay. So I reached out to him and asked him if he could find me some PDFs on Sukkot. Well, next thing you know, virtually every day I'm getting all these PDFs by these really
more than you can read.
more than I can read. I'm still reading them.
Right.
But it was just one PDF after another, and I was just like, this is unbelievably wonderful. And so I have incorporated a ton of these PDFs into this book, with a grateful acknowledgement to Robert Cruikshank, my PDF guy, at the beginning of the book, because I can guarantee you, without his assistance in finding these PDFs for me, the book would not be nearly as good as it is. I just give all the credit in the world to Robert Cruikshank for finding those sources for me and and passing them along. It's just been an absolutely incredible assistance in the writing of the book. But again, what Mike and I want to emphasize tonight is that when when Doug Wilson, Keith Matheson, Ken Gentry, it doesn't matter. When any of these futurists tell us that we are waiting on the resurrection to happen, first of all, notice what they do. They put it at the end of the new covenant age. Wait a minute. It's not a new covenant promise. It's an old covenant promise. So they are implicitly divorcing resurrection from the very covenant to which it belonged, the old covenant age. It was to be at the end of that age that the resurrection would occur. This brings up one of the rabbinic beliefs, which is commonly found in the scholarly literature, and that is that the Jews believed in two ages. And the rabbis most assuredly believed in that. They believed in what they called this age and the age to come. The Ha'olam Haba is what they called the age to come. Okay. This age was generally considered the age of Moses and the law. That's where the temple stood. That's where the temple functioned, in this age. The age to come would be the age of Messiah, the kingdom, the resurrection, the new covenant. But all of that meant this age would pass away. It was supposed to pass away. Now, Dale Allison Jr. in his book, The End of the Ages Has Come, says that there were some, they were not the majority, but there were some Jews who did not believe that, quote, this age would ever fully come, because they did not believe the temple would ever pass away. They did not believe that Torah would pass away, but they were the minority. The great majority of the rabbinic sources seems to indicate that in the age to come, the new covenant, Messiah, the new covenant, and the kingdom would last forever. The book of Baruch states that very, very clearly, that the age to come will last forever and ever without end. Pardon me. So those 3 points are really critical, folks, for understanding even 1 Corinthians 15. Paul and Jesus agreed with the view of 2 ages, just 2 ages. This age, the age to come. This age is the age of Moses and the law. And Mike's already given us a little bit of a preview. Scholar after scholar after scholar has perplexed about, well, wait a minute. Why is Paul, way after the cross, talking about the future end of the law? How could he be doing that? The new covenant's already been established. He's not talking about the end of the gospel, is he? No, he's not. So why is Paul talking about the end of the law when he's talking about resurrection? Oh, well, the reason for it is because the law was the strength of sin, and sin was the sting of death, which will be overcome by the resurrection at the time of the end. All of this ties together and segues together more than beautifully. So here we have 2 ages. This age, the age to come. This age is the age of Moses and the law of which was the strength of sin. The age to come, the age of the new covenant, which is the age of life in Christ Jesus in that new covenant. Once we grasp the covenantal context of resurrection, it puts 1 Corinthians 15 in a totally different light. Instead of it being the end of the current Christian age, i.e., the end of the new covenant age, which is really problematic, don't you think, Michael?
Yeah. The age that has no end is somehow the focus.
Yeah.
I was thinking about you mentioned Dale Allison Jr., and he was talking about that the kind of minority group there that wants the temple to stand and the new covenant to kind of be absorbed with the old there. And I was thinking of Hymenaeus and Philetus. I mean that's and what's going on in 2 Thessalonians 2. These guys, these Judaizers, wanted Jesus. They wanted circumcision too, for the Gentiles, but they wanted the entire old covenant system. So they were teaching a spiritual coming and a spiritual resurrection had already taken place without the destruction of the temple, which was the sign and the symbol when it would all be fulfilled, is what Jesus taught. But they kind of wanted to sweep that under the rug, and they wanted to bring everything in together, just like you were talking about.
That's exactly right. I agree 100%. I don't think we can separate that view of Hymenaeus and Philetus from that Judaizing tendency that wanted to preserve the law and the temple, the priesthood, the sacrifices, and the sanctity of the land. I wrote that little book, as you well know, entitled Misplaced Minds. Paul said in Colossians chapter 3, set your affections on things that are above and not on things on the earth. Well, that's the normal translation. I really believe that overlooks the context. The context is the Judaizers are placing all their emphasis on the law, circumcision, the temple, the cultus, everything about the old covenant. Oh, it's remaining. And Paul said, no. Don't put your affection on, well, it's gi in the Greek, but it's better translated as land. Mm-hmm. So Paul's saying, after discussing all of these things that the Judaizers wanted to retain and carry over into Christ, that would include the law, not only the temple, not only priesthood and sacrifices and circumcision, it would include the sanctity of the land. And Paul says, no. We don't put our emphasis on earth. on earth, on physical land. And I tell you what, if that doesn't have implications for the dispensational world, I don't know what does.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that whole context is the feast days and the law and the elements of the old covenant world system. And he says, do not go back into be in bondage to those elements. Don't set your affection on the things of the land. You got to remember, and we'll get into this because I got into it in my book and at the conference in my lecture on 1 Corinthians 15. There were Jews, missionary Pharisees, that would travel to Colossae, Philippi, Corinth, and they would tell the Jews that had not come back after the Babylonian captivity, with Ezra and Nehemiah, they would tell the Jews there in those synagogues, you're in sin. If you don't come back and be a citizen in Israel, in the land of Israel, you have no hope of eternal life and you will not be raised in the resurrection. If you're not in the land, no resurrection.
That's right.
And we'll talk about what the Corinthian error is in a little bit. But so I think that fits really well with what you're saying. He's telling them, no, don't set your affection on the land, because I know these guys are trying to suck you guys back there, but it's, you have a circumcision without hands because you're in the kingdom cut without hands, the stone cut without hands.
Amen. And, and this all gets to the issue of the resurrection, folks. To whom was that resurrection promise made? Well, once again, what we're emphasizing here, when when futurists, which is what, which Doug and again all of the men who signed the letter, what they're doing is they're placing that resurrection at the end of the wrong covenant. They are affirming the end of the endless new covenant. My word, heaven and earth shall pass away. My words will never pass away. And that word pass away, by the way, fascinating word, and it's associated with Hebrews chapter 12. In Hebrews chapter 12, where the writer says, yet once he shook the earth. And it was at Sinai, at the giving of the law. And by the way, William Lane, in his commentary on Hebrews, agrees with all of this. Not where I got it, but he does agree with it. But he says, yet once more, he says, I shake not only the earth, but the heavens also. Now this, the shaking, means the removal of those things which are shaken. And William Lane says he's not talking about destruction of literal physical heaven and earth there. He's talking about the removal of the covenant that was given at Sinai. That was the shaking of heaven and earth that he was talking about. Right. It's a brilliant comment if you haven't read it, folks. I mean, just William Lane in his commentary on Hebrews on chapter 12, 21 and following. So he sees the shaking of heaven and earth as a covenantal shaking. Well, what was remaining? The new covenant. Now, is the old covenant still on paper? Well, I got all sorts of Bibles stretched out on my desk right here. Sure, on paper, it's still there. It's not remaining as a binding covenant. It's not remaining as an operative covenant.
God would remember it no more.
God would remember it no more. So it doesn't matter. And by the way, Sam Frost actually argued on Facebook for a good little while. Well, the old covenant hasn't passed away because I got a copy of it laying on my desk.
Oh, wow.
I mean,
that guy is just,
oh, wow. It was astounding, literally astounding. But so according to Sam Frost, because there was still ink on paper that recorded Torah, that meant Torah has not passed away. Well, I must admit it's one of the most ridiculous arguments I've ever heard in my life, but he made it, and he made it repeatedly. He didn't make it just once or twice. He made it repeatedly. That is not the force of the removal of the passing of the law of Matthew 5, nor the shaking of the heaven and earth in Hebrews chapter 12. The significance thereof, it would no longer be binding, operative as a covenant imposed on God's people. So here we have, guess what we have? We have Doug Wilson, we have Gentry, We have all of these other men, all these virtually all futurists tell us, well, at the end of the current Christian age, uh, we have the resurrection that takes place. And you go, oh, well, you're telling us the new covenant is going to pass away. Oh, no, no. The new covenant will never pass away. Well, in your theology, it will pass away because the new covenant demands what? That we care for the widows and the orphans. Will there still be widows and orphans in heaven? Will there be widows and orphans in the new heaven and the new earth? Well, no, we're told there won't be widows and orphans either in the new heaven and new earth, nor will there be in heaven. Okay, then the new covenant becomes inoperative. The new covenant teaches that throughout all time, we are to manifest the wonderful wisdom of God by the proclamation of the gospel. Well, the proclamation of the gospel to do what? To believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, right. To turn from sin, to repent. Oh, wait a minute. There won't be any sin. There won't be any repentance. There won't be any need for obeying the gospel in either the new heaven, new earth, or in heaven. Therefore, the gospel becomes inoperative. What does it do? Does it become a museum piece? And so when futurists, such as Doug Wilson, when they tell us they're looking for the resurrection at the end of the Christian age, oh, but wait, the gospel doesn't pass away. Yes, it does in their theology, because it ceases to function as it was given to man to preach to the lost, to bring them to Christ. They don't believe it continues to function in heaven or in the new heaven and new earth for that matter. Therefore, it ceases to be the gospel.
Yeah, they partial preterists have a real hard time teaching this end of world history because they have conceded to us, I would say at least 98, maybe even 99% of the end of the world, end of the age type passages in the New Testament, they say is referring to Israel's old covenant age or world. And
you're exactly right.
And so they're hanging on to this 1 or 2% because they have to be creedal and they have to have, for a lot of them, post-millennialism. I don't want to pick on Kim Burgess. I mean, I really like what they're doing. I mean, I agree with more than I disagree with what he's doing. But, if you only have, the parable of the leaven, Matthew 28, and if you're trying to teach full preterism and you go to Revelation 21 and 22 as teaching the end of world history, you got a problem. But none of those passages teach the end of world history, but because they're trying to still marry the post-millennialism in, they have to have an end somewhere.
Correct.
Because you have to have all the nations Christianized, and then something has to happen.
Israel has to be saved at the end of the Christian age.
Yeah. So it's partial preterism is in a world of hurt, and I'll be interested, both of us will be interested to cross-examine Mr. Wilson, and hopefully he can get another partial preterist that's more like-minded for himself as a partner, or whoever he chooses, if that even happens. But we definitely want to probe not just him, but his entire system.
Absolutely.
Because all of these guys, again, concede about 99% of all these end of the world passages as 80-70. So,
or they resort to arguing, oh, well, yeah, 2 Peter chapter 3, that was primarily 80-70, but it was a type of the real end of the world. That is an argument that I am encountering more and more and more.
I've never, if you read, is it John Owen or John Lightfoot? He says that it's referring to the elements of the old covenant world, and he uses only. There is,
I believe it's John Owen. I was reading that quote, as a matter of fact, just this last week in some research that I was doing. So
every time I quote that, I put only in all caps and bold. So everyone can see this is not some type of something else. He believed it was only. And he also talked about, and I think Milton Terry quotes him on, double fulfillments and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. Kind of poo-pooed him, um, but I think he was inconsistent at the same time on some.
I think you're right on that. Okay, look, folks, we are out of time. What we have tried to lay before you on this particular program is that when futurists such as Doug Wilson and all of the futurists who signed the letter condemning those of us who believe that Jesus kept his word, otherwise known as full preterists, they are affirming the end of the Christian age. They are affirming the end of the gospel, which will never pass away. And at the same time, by affirming a yet future resurrection, they are affirming that Israel after the flesh, must remain as God's covenant people, because those promises of the resurrection were made to Old Covenant Israel as a covenant promise, Isaiah 59, 17 to 21, as a covenant promise to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh. You cannot affirm, as futurists do, a future resurrection without affirming that the old law, every jot and every tittle of it, remains unfulfilled today, still valid, still binding. Israel remains as God's covenant people today. What happens as church? What happens to the gospel? So, thanks for joining us. I managed to get through it, Mike.
Yeah.
My voice feels a little rough right now, I can tell you that, but nonetheless, great to be with you again. I can tell you that. I've missed being with you.
Amen.
So
Good
we'll
show.
say, well, it's almost night here, so I'll say good night and God bless at the time we're making this.
All right. Good night.